Keeping James Joyce out of Oscar Wilde's Purple Trousers. How the Cold War Redefined Ulysses. In his history of James Joyce's critical reception, Joyce's critics, Joseph Brooker describes a pattern that arose early around Ulysses. Even prior to its publication in 1922, Ulysses was already being decried and championed by competing editors, social activists, artists, critics, and organizations, all of which found in this mysterious, intimidating production solutions to a range of political, aesthetic, moral, and of course, professional problems. However, because the literary periods that were being studied in the Anglo-American Academy did not, until after World War II, extend into the 20th century, all of this maneuvering to align with or in opposition to Ulysses went on outside the Academy. This paper is part of a larger project examining the critical approaches that were forged during the mid-20th century period when Ulysses was first moving into the United States Academy. By the mid-1950s, Joseph McCarthy's infamous witch hunt for communist sympathizers had been disgraced. Yet its attendant lavender scare linking homosexuality with political dissent raged on all through the Cold War and beyond. And it was at this unpropitious moment when, empowered by the nation's post-war prosperity, U.S. academics were laying the groundwork for Joyce studies and for 20th century literary studies. Accordingly, these innovators were faced with two daunting tasks. If Ulysses was to be taught and studied, as Hugh Kenner observes, its advocates in the Academy first had to find a way to read it. Equally importantly, any proposed critical framework that they came up with had to produce readings that could be safely reproduced in the college classroom. Academic Joyceans, that is, unlike their artistic, literary, or culturally subversive forebears, had to propose some plausible critical framework while also neutralizing what Joe McCarthy would have termed the novel's relentless subversiveness, especially the deviant sexual thoughts, acts, memories, and desires that are the very stuff of which the novel is made. For today's paper, I'm examining an early literary critical article by Ellsworth Mason focusing on Ulysses' episode Nausicaa. It is perhaps to be expected that this early argument for Ulysses' adoption into the Western literary canon focuses on the Nausicaa episode, which was the only part of the novel that was ever banned as obscene in the United States. In the 1921 obscenity trial brought by New York State against the Little Review, Nausicaa's depiction of an older man, Leopold Bloom, masturbating to orgasm while observing a young woman, Gertie McDowell, reclining on a rock at the beach, was found to pose a moral danger to younger readers. In 1933, however, in a precedent-setting ruling, Judge John M. Woolsey declared Ulysses a licit work of art when read in its entirety. That left Nausicaa, in effect, obscene in isolation, but not when read as part of Ulysses. That is where things stood in 1948 when Ellsworth Mason defended the first dissertation ever written on James Joyce. And it is where things remained in 1956 when Mason's manifesto, James Joyce Moralist, appeared in the first volume of 20th century literature. In the world beyond the Academy, Ulysses had been thriving as a famously dirty book. In a society as reactive as 1950s America, however, academics who wanted to teach and study Joyce saw the book's most ardent non-academic admirers, like Judge Woolsey, who had noted with sympathy the recurrent emergence of the theme of sex in the minds of Joyce's characters, posed a serious threat to the novel's admission into the Academy. Authorized by his doctoral work at Yale in the mid-1950s, Ellsworth Mason set out to establish the new professional ground rules that secured a place of honor for Ulysses in the U.S. Academy, and funding, resources, and prestige for those who studied the novel. To correctly understand Ulysses, Mason argued, a new cohort of trained, qualified readers must start from the understanding that, quote, Ulysses is a profoundly moral book, end quote, and that Joyce is, quote, one of the most responsible artists of this or any other century, end quote. The first responsibility of these professional Ulyssians would be to stand in opposition to Joyce's untrained or ignorant non-academic readers whose unforgivable error had been to, quote, clothe Joyce in Oscar Wilde's purple trousers and the seven horns of the apocalyptic beast, end quote. One key implication here is that were Joyce defending or even objectively depicting sexual diversity, he would be immoral, and the claims of both his detractors and his untrained adherents would not be ignorant, but justified, and they would justify Joyce's exclusion from the Western canon. In other words, Mason was directly contradicting Judge Woolsey, asserting that depictions of non-standard sexual thoughts and acts should discredit Ulysses, and disclaiming the existence of any such depictions. In a fulminating rebuttal of the prior consensus shared by Ulysses haters and Ulysses lovers alike, Mason casually shakes off a series of quotations that he provides from overheated early reviews, condemning Ulysses', quote, leprous and scabrous horrors, end quote, with the contemptuous dismissal, they shame themselves. Yet, such negligible minds in the gutter merited even this single withering glance because, as Mason said, they have highly intellectual relatives who, though they recognize Ulysses as a masterpiece, continue to attack the book's morality. In this way, Mason links the attacks of Ulysses' early critics to the approving acceptance of the novel's sexual omnivorousness among its advocates by treating the latter's tolerant acceptance as both equally wrong and equally hostile, equally attacking the novel. According to Mason, Ulysses' body has been confused with its soul. He concedes that the text presents immoral actions, which are sometimes sexual, but more often are not. However, to charge Ulysses with amorality, he says, is to conclude that the society and characters which it presents are merely set forth, rather than judged. And, by this transitive property, to read anything that Mason deems immoral as merely set forth in Ulysses is to traitorously attack James Joyce. We have here what would remain through the 1990s as the founding critical assumptions whereby Ulysses, which could be counted on to continue to attract undergraduate and graduate readers with its ineradicable reputation as dirty as well as difficult, could and would be sanitized as needed through straight-up confident denial. Mason set forth two givens. To the extent that the novel is deeply concerned with ethics, it is largely unconcerned with sexual ethics. And to the extent that it is concerned with sexual ethics, those ethics conform absolutely to mainstream middle-class attitudes that can be promoted in college classrooms and celebrated in the sort of scholarship that gets a professor promoted within rather than hounded out of the academy. Only ignorance, Mason asserts, could account for any possible association of Joyce with homosexuality or other sexual abominations. Such associations are only proposed by Joyce's enemies, whom it is the responsibility of trained Joyceans to discredit. Joyce is, in fact, celebrating the opposite of sexual deviance, which is, of course, according to Mason, the inextinguishable greatness of man, which is confirmed in Ulysses by the relentless judgment Joyce imposes on all the immoral acts and people he depicts. Mason sets out to demonstrate Joyce's adherence to sexual prejudices that correspond strikingly to those of Joe McCarthy through his reading of Ulysses' few sexual references in Nausicaa. Mason's reading of Gertie McDowell's inner life as a mess of stereotyped sentimental thoughts is admittedly a reasonable interpretation of the textual evidence. Once Mason links Gertie to stereotyped sentimentality, however, he goes on to set a terrible and even crazy-making precedent for Joyceans in training by abandoning textual specifics in favor of a series of ad feminine attacks against Gertie that aren't anchored to anything. By describing the episode's overall action as a temptation and characterizing Gertie in terms such as vulgar, sordid, and reprehensible, Mason interprets the episode's moral view of female sexual desire as scathingly hostile. It is inherently terrible for women to have a sex drive. Extraordinarily, Mason reads what Joyce has constructed with algebraic precision as a sexual encounter that is a near miracle of reciprocity and consent as a Manichaean juxtaposition between Bloom, embodying sexual continence, and Gertie, the embodiment of sexual depravity. Bloom is moral specifically in that he makes no attempt to respond to Gertie's overt invitation. If Gertie's mental processes are the sordid product of modern confusions, Bloom's detached awareness of Gertie's biological reactions and his sensory awareness of her sexual arousal confirm Bloom's status as a Cartesian rational subject whose empirical perceptions humiliatingly further reduce Gertie to a fleshly and thus vile case study, fit only to be morally and medically assessed. On the other hand, Bloom, in assessing and responding to her being turned on, semi-virtuously withdraws by amusing himself, as the French put it. Bloom's act of public masturbation is an act of moral restraint. One wonders if he thought the same about the queer old josser in an encounter. In any case, Bloom's noble act of public abstention elevates his pre-orgasmic musings to wisdom, and it is through them that he delivers the greatest moral judgment of the episode when he thinks of Gertie as a hot little devil. And this is his greatest humanist insight, because Gertie has a sex drive. It means she is diabolical. That is what Joyce wants us to get from Nausicaa. Once Mason has extracted these sexual details and established Gertie as Ulysses' preeminent moral monster, he goes on to redefine the Bloom-Gertie interaction as, in fact, not a sex scene at all. It is not erotic, he asserts, because no hands are laid on whiteness and not a single panting word is exchanged. Mason in Nausicaa is able to make all sex disappear, or else reduce the remainder to a metonym for absolute evil, by maldistributing guilty sexual transgression to evil Gertie and virtuous sexual continence to Bloom in a zero-sum manner. Bloom's role in Nausicaa's moral lesson involves resisting sexual temptation. Bloom, quote, makes no attempt to respond to the stationary, mobility-impaired Gertie, whom Mason reads as a sexual predator. He refrains, he withdraws, and in a relationship as dependent upon cooperation as sex, he stands alone, and his orgasm marks what Mason construes as the very obverse of sex, as a, quote, climax in his isolation, end quote. Mason's attitudes in this polemic could be read less as heteronormative than as straight-up misogyny. Yet it would be incorrect to view misogyny as Mason's primary motivation, rather than as a widely accepted ideological means to a more all-encompassing end. The vile misogyny for which early Joyce studies is so notable serves here in the above reading, and I think throughout a lot of the early Joyce criticism, to distract the reader's attention from everything that makes the Gertie Bloom encounter consensual and less detrimental and instrumentalizing, which is to say more deviant and more moral, since instrumentalization and detriment are written into the heterosexual contract, than socially sanctioned heteronormative arrangements. The following review of Nausicaa represents, or overview of Nausicaa represents a condensed compilation of the most intransigent textual evidence that Mason's fixation on Gertie's shocking immorality allows him to overlook so as to reach his desired conclusions. First, the Gertie-Bloom sex scene entails an anonymous public sex act that artfully combines the most stigmatized aspects of both autoeroticism and sexual intercourse, masturbation, and anonymous street sex. That makes it a super deviant sex act taking place between two suspiciously gender fluid individuals, each of whom would have been of more than passing interest to sexologists of the period. And Joyce words describes them in terms that make this clear. Bloom is a womanly man, and Gertie a self-consciously performative specimen of winsome Irish girlhood. Joyce's fascination with gender ambiguity, cross-dressing, and sexual transformations manifests in Bloom's intuitive apprehension of Gertie's lived experience of female embodiment. Conversely, the hyperbolically feminine Gertie, whose attentiveness to her own feminine performance is suggestive of drag, thinks with pleasure of her friend Sissy Caffrey's unforgettable adventure in cross-dressing, a scenario that invokes what will elsewhere be shown to be one of Bloom's sexual kinks, and resonates with Bloom's intense sexual interest in masculine women. Thus, Gertie seems to pick up on Bloom's physiological reactions just as he has intuited hers. From a perspective that is, in fact, more similar to Bloom's than her own, Gertie thinks admiringly of the unforgettable evening Sissy Caffrey, quote, dressed up in her father's suit and hat and the burned cork mustache, and walked down Tritonville Road smoking a cigarette, end quote. If Mason was horrified at the thought of Joyce being put into, let alone wanting to get into, Oscar Wilde's Purple Trousers, through his influence, subsequent generations of Joyce scholars were not so much outraged as systematically desensitized to all the queer getting into and out of trousers that occurs across Ulysses, starting with the significance of trousers in Buck Mulligan's sexual bullying of Stephen in Telemachus. Throughout Telemachus, Mulligan expresses his interest in taking trousers off of men, including Stephen, in putting trousers on Stephen in particular, and in explaining to Stephen what Oscar Wilde would advise as to which clothes he should put on or take off. The Gertie-Bloom tryst differs from Mulligan's sexual goading of Stephen, in which Mulligan is cast, as elsewhere, in the role of Lord Alfred Douglas, ruinously attempting to manipulate a superior artist, not because it is less queer, but because it seems to have been made as queer as possible, specifically, in this case, to make it as consensual, benign, and in short, as moral as a sexual encounter can possibly be. Bloom is even, in this encounter, expressly inverting the Old Testament injunction against spilling one's seed in any non-procreative act in a manner that is explicitly humane. That is, Bloom has refrained from spilling his seed in Molly's or any other vagina for the past 11 years, and he has done so for ethical reasons, because for women, pregnancy is perilous even when it is not ruinous. Even Bloom's hedging breach of his marital vows is rendered reciprocal, since Bloom knows Molly has likewise agreed to an extramarital tryst. Finally, and really conclusively, any critic seriously assessing Joyce's moral evaluation of the sex act in which Bloom and Gertie engage is surely obliged to consider how the Bloom-Gertie encounter compares to the famous public, non-procreative, non-commercial exchange between James Joyce and Nora Barnacle that critics like to believe happened on June 16, 1904, the day immortalized by Joyce in Ulysses. Although we can never be absolutely certain of the date when Nora Barnacle first walked out with James Joyce, took him down a side street, and made a man of him, in Joyce's words, Joyce's letters to Nora leave us in no doubt that he considered this event sacred, specifically because it was non-consensual and non-commercial. That is, because it was deviant. It did not conform to either of the ways heterosexuality worked in Dublin, usually. Mason believed that he was getting rid of a viciously erroneous reading of Joyce as a sexual deviant, um, and that any reading that was predicated on the idea that Joyce could be brilliant as well as a pervert um, should be unthinkable. Yet, while virtually no one at this time was prepared to consider the compendium of sexual deviance from which the very fabric of Ulysses is woven as the novel's medium and therefore its message, Mason's strident attack on those he labeled Joyce's enemies contributed to a long-standing institutional firewall that did significantly forestall the encounter between Ulysses and queer theory that has only quite recently proved to be so fruitful once it finally was breached. As Joyceans often like to remind audiences at the end of our talks or papers, Joyce's great biographer Richard Ellman once observed that we are still laboring to become Joyce's contemporaries. Certainly, decrypting all the queer, deviant, and perverse sex in Ulysses, so long occluded by reading habits that have been inculcated throughout the English-speaking world, is one more step on the long march to catch up with James Joyce. However, as Martin Luther King implies concerning the arc of the universe, which is long and only in the long haul bends toward justice, and as Stephen's teacher insists in Portrait when he calls out Stephen for writing that human souls cannot approach nearer to God, apparently the theologically correct belief is that we cannot reach God, but that we can, with effort, move closer. The pursuit of clarity, justice, and goodness is, by its nature, long, incremental, and painstaking. It may well be that we will never learn to be Joyce's contemporaries, but we have continued to move persistently in that direction, enabled, paradoxically, by the academic spaces Mason Ellsworth helped to establish that for so long imposed these distortions and disavowals as the price of this ongoing work. Thank you.